asking whether rural communities can actually absorb the innovations being thrown at them, and whether the research on how firms learn from outside knowledge has anything useful to say about that. Plus, hemp bricks in South Africa, a robotics startup in Kenya, and China's 5-year plan for rural revitalization. Stay with us. I'm Art.
I'm Jen.
And this is the Rural Innovator, a weekly look at the research, news, and projects shaping rural innovation, drawn from the library at ruralinnovations.org.
Let's start with the research this week. And I want to be upfront about something. 2 of the 3 articles in this week's batch are foundational theoretical papers, not new empirical studies. So we're going to use them as lenses, tools for interpreting the rest of what we're seeing in the news and the field.
Which I actually appreciate. Sometimes the library surfaces older work that the field keeps returning to, and it's worth asking why.
Exactly. So the first one is a 2002 paper in the Academy of Management Review by Zara and George, Absorptive Capacity, a Review, Reconceptualization, and Extension. If you've spent any time in the innovation literature, you've probably heard the term absorptive capacity. This paper is largely responsible for the way we use it today.
Before we get into the framework, what's the core problem they're solving? What was missing before this paper?
The concept itself came from Cohen and Leventhal back in 1990. Their version was about a firm's ability to recognize the value of new external knowledge, assimilate it, and apply it commercially. Useful, but relatively flat. Zara and George said, hold on, there are actually 2 very different things happening here, and conflating them causes real confusion.
Right, so they split it.
They split it into what they call potential absorptive capacity and realized absorptive capacity. Potential is the acquisition and assimilation side. You're scanning the environment, you're bringing knowledge in, you understand what it means. Realized is transformation and exploitation. You actually do something with it. You reconfigure it, you apply it, you generate value.
And those can come apart. A community or an organization can be very good at acquiring knowledge and just not be able to act on it.
That's one of the paper's sharpest insights. Yes. And they introduce this concept they call the efficiency factor, the ratio between your realized and your potential capacity. Organizations can score high on potential and low on realized. They're learning a lot. They just can't convert it into outcomes.
I've seen that in rural communities. There's no shortage of workshops, pilot projects, and research reports landing on the desks of rural development offices. The knowledge is coming in. What's missing is the infrastructure to do something with it.
And Zara and George would say that's not an accident. It reflects something structural about prior knowledge, about social integration mechanisms, about whether there are people in the organization whose job it is to actually bridge between knowledge acquisition and implementation.
So it's not just about having a smart team. It's about having the right connective tissue inside the organization.
Right. And they're explicit that absorptive capacity isn't a static trait. It's dynamic. It changes as organizations invest in it or neglect it. The paper also flags that prior related knowledge is a prerequisite. You can't absorb what you have no foundation to understand.
Which has a slightly uncomfortable implication for rural communities that have experienced persistent brain drain. If your knowledge base keeps leaving, your absorptive capacity erodes.
That's a real implication, and I don't think it's one the paper engages with directly. It's written for the firm-level context, but the translation is pretty obvious.
What are the limitations here? I mean, it's a conceptual paper. What should we be careful about?
A few things. First, it's a framework paper, not an empirical study. The model is logical and well-argued, but it's not derived from data. Second, and this is something later scholars have pushed on, the firm-level framing assumes a bounded organization with clear boundaries, rural communities, ecosystems, regions. Those are much messier units of analysis.
The boundaries of a rural economy are not the same as the boundaries of a manufacturing firm.
Precisely. And third, the paper tends to treat knowledge as relatively unproblematic. It doesn't spend a lot of time on power dynamics, on who decides which external knowledge is worth acquiring, or on what happens when external knowledge conflicts with local knowledge and practice.
Which is a real tension in rural development. Not all external knowledge is welcome, and not all of it should be.
I'd go further and say some of the most damaging rural development interventions in history have been cases of very high external knowledge, just the wrong knowledge, imposed without the absorptive capacity question even being asked.
All right, that's worth sitting with. Let's move to the second paper, Rogers on the Diffusion of Innovations, which is also foundational, and which also shows up in this week's library in a slightly unusual application.
Right, so the citation in the library is Rogers' Diffusion of Innovations. But the specific document they're linking to through CiteSeer applies diffusion theory to a very particular context. Natural environments approaches in early intervention services for children, early childhood disability services, which is not what most people think of when they hear rural innovation.
It surprised me. What's the argument being made?
So, natural environments approaches. The idea that children receiving early intervention services should be served in natural, inclusive settings like homes and community playgroups rather than clinical settings have been mandated in U.S. federal law since 1991. And yet, as of the time this paper was written, adoption had been slow and uneven.
So you have a legally mandated innovation that still isn't diffusing. That's a puzzle.
And the authors use Rogers' framework to explain why. The barriers they identify include lack of public awareness, clinical system incentives that actually work against adoption, vendor systems that benefit from the status quo, and insufficient family engagement. You know Rogers, early adopters, late majority, laggards. But the paper is arguing that the shape of adoption isn't really about individual characteristics here. It's about institutional resistance.
Which maps onto rural contexts in ways that should make people uncomfortable. How many rural health innovations, broadband programs, or agricultural technology initiatives have been mandated in some sense, funded, legislated, required, and still haven't moved?
The list is long, and the Rogerian lens helps explain why. The diffusion model isn't just about whether an innovation is good, it's about the social system it's entering, the communication channels that carry it, and the time dimension. All three can be broken independently.
What's your read on the limits of diffusion theory for rural contexts specifically?
My honest read is that Rogers is a useful map, but it can become a trap. The framework is inherently pro-innovation. It tends to assume the innovation is good, and the question is just how to spread it. That framing can pathologize non-adoption, calling it resistance, when it might actually be a rational response to a bad fit.
I'd push back slightly on that. Rogers himself, in later editions, was pretty clear-eyed about the failures of diffusion. He spent a lot of time on consequences and on the fact that diffusion can spread harm as well as benefit.
Fair. The framework is more nuanced than its popular application. My concern is more with how practitioners use it, where it becomes a marketing problem rather than a design problem.
That's a fair distinction. Market the innovation better versus rethink whether the innovation is right for this context.
And the absorptive capacity paper we just discussed actually complements Rogers here, in a useful way. Diffusion theory asks how innovations spread through a social system. Absorptive capacity asks whether the receiving end can actually make use of what arrives. You need both lenses.
Let's do the third paper and then hold the synthesis for closing thoughts, because I think there's something here that threads through the whole week.
Agreed. The third paper is Lorson and Salter, Open for Innovation, published in the Strategic Management Journal in 2006. This one is empirical. They're working with data from a large survey of UK manufacturing firms.
What's the core finding?
The finding is that firms which search more broadly and deeply for external knowledge, more sources, deeper engagement with those sources, do show better innovation performance, but only up to a point. Beyond that point, performance declines. The relationship is an inverted U.
So there's an optimal level of openness, and going past it actually hurts you.
Right. And they're measuring two distinct dimensions: breadth, which is the number of external knowledge sources a firm uses, and depth, which is how intensively they engage with those sources. Both follow the same inverted U pattern independently.
What's driving the decline on the far side of the curve?
They don't fully resolve that, but the theoretical argument is about cognitive load and coordination costs. If you're pulling from too many sources too deeply, you spend more time managing the inflow than you do actually innovating. It's the organizational equivalent of having so many tabs open your browser freezes.
Which is a real thing. I've seen rural economic development organizations that are part of so many networks, so many coalitions, so many information sharing agreements that their staff are essentially in meetings all day and nothing gets built.
The paper is careful to say this is UK manufacturing, so the generalizability has limits. Rural organizations in Saskatchewan, Saskatchewan, are not UK manufacturers. The sample is relatively large. They're working with something like 2,000 firms. So the statistical findings are robust within that context. But the mechanism they're proposing is general enough that I think it travels.
What would optimal breadth even look like for a rural municipality or a rural development organization? That seems very context dependent.
Completely context dependent, and that's actually one of the paper's limitations. It identifies that an optimum exists, but it can't tell you where it is for any given organization. You'd have to figure that out empirically for your context, your capacity, your team size.
Which is frustrating from a practitioner standpoint. You're probably doing too much networking as not actionable advice.
Right. But be deliberate about which external sources you invest deeply in, and recognize that adding more sources isn't always better. That is actionable. It's a reframe.
All right, let's move into the news and developments for the week. There's a lot happening globally, and I want to make sure we give each item enough room.
Let's start with the EU Rural Innovation Forum. AEIDL, the European Association for Innovation and Local Development, is hosting the second EU Rural Innovation Forum on June 9th, 2026. It's an online event.
What's the framing? What question is this event actually trying to answer?
The framing is about moving from pilots to systems. The problem they're naming is one that anyone in rural development knows. You get a successful innovation pilot, it works in one village or one region, and then it just stops there. It doesn't scale, it doesn't become policy, it doesn't change the conditions that made it necessary in the first place.
Smart villages is the context here, right? The EU has been running smart village initiatives for years, and the question of what sticks beyond the project lifecycle is a real one.
Exactly. And the forum is explicitly bringing together EU institutions, policymakers, and rural innovation practitioners to discuss governance and ecosystem conditions, what's required at the systems level for pilots to achieve lasting change, which is a much harder question than, did this pilot work?
I'll say this. The fact that they're on the second iteration of this forum tells you something. The first one presumably surfaced the problem without resolving it, which means the gap between pilot and system is stubborn.
And it maps directly back to absorptive capacity. Frankly, the question isn't whether rural communities in Europe can recognize good innovation ideas. The question is whether the governance systems have the realized capacity to transform those ideas into durable institutions.
If you're working in rural policy in Canada, the UK, Australia, this forum is worth watching even if you're not in Europe. The governance questions travel.
Next item. And this one I find genuinely exciting. Researchers at the University of Johannesburg have developed a hemp-based brick for rural housing in South Africa. The material is carbon negative, has good thermal properties, fire resistance, and mold protection.
Before we get into the technical properties, what's the housing context in rural South Africa that this is responding to?
There's a significant rural housing deficit. Many rural communities are still using materials that are thermally inefficient in a climate that can be both very hot and cold, that require import and supply chains that are difficult to maintain in remote areas, and that contribute to rather than mitigate environmental degradation. This brick is trying to answer several of those problems at once.
Carbon negative is a strong claim. What does that mean in practice for a building material?
Hemp as a crop is a carbon sink during its growth phase. It sequesters more carbon than it releases. When you lock that hemp into a building material, you're effectively storing that carbon in the structure. So the life cycle accounting is net negative. Or at least that's the claim. The article doesn't provide the full life cycle analysis, so I'd want to see the methodology before making too much of it.
Fair. But the job creation dimension is interesting to me. They're explicitly framing hemp cultivation and sustainable construction as an employment pathway.
Which is the rural innovation double play. You're solving a housing problem and a livelihoods problem simultaneously by developing a local supply chain. Hemp cultivation, processing, brick manufacturing. Those are rural jobs that don't require metropolitan infrastructure.
The question I'd want answered is about the regulatory environment. Hemp cultivation in South Africa has been heavily regulated, and the transition to licensed industrial hemp growing is still pretty new. How does that affect whether this scales?
The article doesn't address that directly, and it's a real gap. Material innovation and regulatory infrastructure have to develop together, or the innovation sits on a shelf. This is Rogers again. The social system matters as much as the technology.
Let's talk about ZeroBionic and the Qualcomm cohort. A Kenyan startup developing assistive robotics selected from over 1,200 applicants across 45 African countries.
Right. ZeroBionic is developing assistive robotics for people with disabilities. They've been selected for Qualcomm's 2026 Make in Africa Mentorship Cohort, which is a significant piece of recognition given the scale of the applicant pool.
Walk me through what the Make in Africa program actually provides. It's not just a badge, right?
The program provides mentorship, engineering support, intellectual property assistance, which is huge for a startup in a context where IP protection is both important and hard to access, and presumably connections to Qualcomm's broader technology ecosystem.
The rural angle here is worth naming explicitly. Assistive technology in Kenya, and across much of sub-Saharan Africa, is almost entirely an urban story. People with disabilities in rural areas have dramatically less access to any kind of assistive technology, let alone robotics.
That's an important framing, and the article doesn't explicitly address the rural dimension, so we should be careful not to overextend. But the broader point stands. If ZeroBionic is building for affordability and local manufacturing, the question of whether that reaches rural areas is not a hypothetical.
And the 45-country applicant pool is worth sitting with. That's a signal about the depth of the innovation ecosystem building across the continent, not just in the obvious hubs.
1,200 applications is a remarkable number. And the selection of a Kenyan startup speaks to Nairobi's role as one of the stronger tech ecosystems on the continent. But it also raises questions about which kinds of rural innovators have the capacity to even apply to something like this.
The absorptive capacity problem shows up again. You have to have enough of a foundation to get on a runway like this.
Let's do the last two news items together, because they're both about national-scale agricultural policy, China and Brazil, and they're usefully contrasted.
China first. This is from CGTN, So State Media, which is a context worth flagging. The piece covers how China's 15th five-year plan is prioritizing rural revitalization through specialized regional industries.
The examples are striking. Sensor-controlled greenhouses, medicinal herb cultivation, tea plantations, AI-enabled strawberry factories. These are not marginal experiments. This is the state actively building out differentiated rural industry profiles based on local agricultural conditions.
The one village, one product logic has been around in Asia for decades. Japan pioneered it. What's different here is the scale of state investment and the integration of AI and sensor technology into the production model.
And the fact that it's tied to a national planning document gives it a different character than a pilot program or a regional initiative. There's a mandate, there's funding, there's a timeline. Whether that mandate actually translates to outcomes on the ground in rural Yunnan or Sichuan is a separate question.
Which is the skeptic's question about top-down rural innovation policy. The plan looks coherent from Beijing. What it looks like in a specific village in Sichuan is very different.
The article doesn't address implementation gaps. And given the source, I'd want to see independent verification of the claims about outcomes, but the strategy itself, specialized regional agriculture supported by technology investment and state policy, is worth understanding as a model, even if you'd apply it very differently in a democratic, market-oriented context.
Now, Brazil is a very different story. The AgTech Navigator piece on Brazil's agricultural innovation and sustainability, and this one leads with the exports figure. $169.2 billion in agricultural goods in 2025.
That number is staggering, and the article is framing Brazil as a model, not just a successful exporter, but a place that has genuinely built a world-class agricultural innovation system.
The emphasis is on biologicals, biological pest and disease control rather than synthetic chemicals, and on AI integration in production. The article credits free market policy and private investment as the main drivers.
And here's where I gently push back on the article's framing. Embrapa, the Brazilian Agricultural Research Corporation, is a state institution. Brazil's agricultural research infrastructure was largely built through deliberate public investment over decades. The free market story is not the whole story.
That's a fair point. The productivity gains in the Cerrado region didn't happen because markets were left alone. They happened because a state research institution spent 30 years figuring out how to make tropical soils productive.
So the lesson from Brazil isn't step back and let the market work. The lesson is more like durable agricultural innovation requires long-term public research investment, combined with an entrepreneurial ecosystem that can commercialize what the research produces. That's a different message.
And the biologicals trend is worth flagging for rural innovators in North America and elsewhere. If synthetic input costs keep rising and regulatory pressure on certain classes of chemicals increases, there's a big opening for biological alternatives. Brazil is several years ahead of most markets in operationalizing that shift.
The contrast with China is instructive too. Both are large countries with massive rural sectors. One is pursuing rural innovation primarily through state-directed planning. The other has built an export powerhouse through a mix of public research and private commercialization. Neither is a pure model. Both have things to teach.
All right, let's get to organizations and events, and then we've got a closing conversation I'm really looking forward to.
The main event to flag this week, and it's also in the news items, but it deserves its own mention here, is the EU Rural Innovation Forum on June 9th, online, organized by AEIDL. If you're working in rural policy, rural ecosystem development, or smart village programming anywhere in Europe, or in jurisdictions that are watching the EU's rural agenda, this is genuinely worth registering for.
The governance angle is what I'd emphasize. This isn't a showcase of cool rural projects. It's specifically about the conditions that allow pilots to become policy. That's a harder and more important question, and it's rare to see an event that holds that question at the center.
The breadth of participants, EU institutions, member state policymakers, rural practitioners, and presumably researchers, means it's also a networking opportunity that crosses the usual disciplinary silos. The conversations that happen in the hallways, or in this case the chat boxes, are often as valuable as the formal presentations.
I'd also note, for listeners outside Europe, that watching how the EU framework's governance for rural innovation is useful even if you're never going to be subject to EU policy. They've invested enormously in building the evidence base for what works. Reading the outputs of events like this is one of the more efficient ways to stay current on that literature.
And it's online, which removes the access barrier. Register, attend what's useful, skip what isn't. The threshold to participate is low.
We'll have the link in the show notes and in the library at ruralinnovations.org. Anything else on the organization side this week?
The University of Johannesburg's research group developing the hemp brick. They're not separately listed as an organization in the library, but they're worth putting on your radar if you work in sustainable rural construction or rural housing policy in southern Africa. This kind of applied materials research coming out of a South African university is the infrastructure of an emerging ecosystem, even if it doesn't have a formal name yet.
And Qualcomm's Make in Africa program is worth knowing about as an accelerator and mentorship vehicle for African hardware and tech startups. The application numbers alone suggest it has real credibility in the ecosystem. If you're working with rural innovators on the continent who are building physical technology, that pathway exists.
All right, closing thoughts. You said you were looking forward to this one. What's the thread you're pulling on?
So here's what I keep coming back to. This week we had 3 foundational theoretical papers and 4 or 5 news items from very different parts of the world: South Africa, Kenya, China, Brazil, Europe. On the surface, they're unconnected, but I keep seeing the same underlying problem appear in all of them.
Which is?
The gap between having an innovation and being able to use it. Absorptive capacity, diffusion barriers, the inverted U of external search. The EU form's whole reason for existing. The hemp brick sitting in a lab while housing remains a crisis. These are all versions of the same problem.
I think that's right, and I want to add a layer. What the research this week is collectively suggesting is that the problem isn't usually technical. It's not that rural communities lack access to good ideas. The problem is structural. It's about whether the receiving context has the capacity, the governance, the connective tissue, and the right calibration of openness to actually absorb and deploy what's available.
And that structural problem is harder to solve than a technical one. You can fund a pilot, you can develop a hemp brick, you can select a startup for a mentorship program. What you can't do easily is build realized absorptive capacity in a system that's been under-resourced for a generation.
Though I'd push back slightly on the pessimism there, Zara and George's whole argument is that absorptive capacity is dynamic. It can be built. The question is whether the investments are made in the right places. And the EU Forum is at least asking that question at the governance level, which is the right level to ask it.
True, but building it requires sustained commitment. Brazil's example is instructive there. Embrapa wasn't built in a 5-year plan. It was decades of consistent public investment in a specific kind of knowledge infrastructure. The payoff is real, but the timeline is long.
Which creates a political problem, because rural innovation tends to get evaluated on election cycles, not on the timescales where it actually produces results. A hemp brick pilot gets funded. A 30-year materials science research program in rural South Africa doesn't.
And that's where the Lawson and Salter finding becomes interesting at a systems level, not just an organizational one. The optimal breadth argument. There's a version of that for public investment in rural innovation. You can spread resources across too many pilots too shallowly and get nothing. Or you can go deep on a smaller number of things and actually build realized capacity.
That's an interesting translation of the finding, and I'm not sure Lawson and Salter would endorse it. They're making a specific claim about firm-level external search, not about public investment allocation. But the logic is analogous.
I'm not claiming it's their argument. I'm saying the pattern rhymes.
Fair. And it rhymes in a way that's useful for practitioners and policymakers. If I'm a rural development funder and I take this week's research seriously, I'm asking myself, are we spreading too thin? Are we acquiring knowledge without ever realizing it? Are we investing in pilots without investing in the governance infrastructure that turns pilots into systems?
And the news this week shows that these questions are live everywhere. In Europe, in Africa, in Asia, in South America. The contexts are wildly different. The underlying challenge is not.
One thing I want to name before we close, the ZeroBionic story sits a little differently for me than the others. It's not about policy or research infrastructure. It's about a specific founder or founding team who built something good enough to be recognized out of 1,200 applicants across 45 countries. That's not a system story, that's a people story.
And there's something important in that. All of the systems thinking in the world, all the absorptive capacity frameworks and governance forms, ultimately depends on individual people deciding to build things in difficult contexts. The structural conditions matter enormously, but they don't produce innovation on their own.
Right? The structure creates conditions, people create innovations, and the gap between the two is where rural development lives.
I think that's actually the sharpest thing either of us has said today.
I'll take it. One more thought, and then we should wrap. The China and Brazil comparison is one I'd encourage listeners to sit with, because it complicates a lot of simple narratives. Both countries have achieved significant rural agricultural innovation outcomes, one through heavy state direction, one through a blend of public research and private markets. Neither is a pure model. Both have failed in different ways.
And both are pursuing scale in ways that smaller rural economies can't directly replicate. The lesson isn't do what Brazil did. The lesson is understand what actually drove Brazil's outcomes and ask which elements are transferable to your context at your scale.
Which requires exactly the kind of analytical capacity, there's that word again, that the absorptive capacity framework is pointing to. You have to be able to read the evidence, translate it, and apply it. That's not automatic.
All right, that's the week. This has been one of the more theoretically rich episodes we've had in a while, and I hope it's been useful rather than just abstract.
That's the week. The full library, every article we discussed, and the newsletter that started this whole conversation are at ruralinnovations.org.
See you next Friday.